I'd like to introduce Dr. Karsten Liber, moderator of this session. Dr. Liber is the Interim Executive Director of the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan, former director of the university's world-famous Toxicology Center, before leading the creation of the USask Water Research Group, which in 2011 evolved into the Global Institute for Water Security. So Karsten apparently is the reason why I'm here. Dr. Liber built the university's Toxicology Center to become Canada's largest and most renowned university-based environmental toxicology research and training center. Dr. Liber has served on several Canadian government science panels and advisory boards, primarily under Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health Canada. In addition to being a distinguished professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability, Dr. Liber has also been actively involved in international research, especially in China, where he holds the title of Concurrent Distinguished Professor at Shaanxi University. Dr. Liber served as president of the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, or CTAC North America, in 2015-2016, and was on the CTAC Board of Directors from 2012 through 2017. It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Karsten Liber, to the PAW 2021 conference.
Thank you very much, Jay, and good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the last session on climate action and energy. And I agree, I got tired just watching that video, and I wasn't even jumping around. Oh my God, I need to be a lot fitter than I am these days to participate in that level of exercise. But getting back on track, there will be 3 presenters in the session this afternoon. Each will have 20 minutes to speak, and I kindly ask all of the presenters to please adhere to that. After the three presentations, there will be a 10 to 15 minute question and answer period, just like there's been in all of the other sessions in this conference. And again, as has been common practice during the presentations, the chat function will be turned off, and it'll then be turned on again at the end of the presentation so that the audience can submit questions to the speakers. Personally, I really look forward to this session. Climate change is clearly one of the most pressing problems of our times. And so many different aspects of our societies contribute to the problem, from heating and cooling to transportation to agriculture and everything in between. Cuts across all sectors of society, and addressing it requires social innovation and truly global solutions. While we could likely spend an entire day focusing just on climate change and its challenges and potential adaptation solutions and so forth, we only have 3 presentations on the topic here today. But maybe someday we'll devote an entire event to the theme of climate change. I certainly hope that will be the case. But getting us back on track, with respect to the first presenter today, in this, our final thematic session, our first speaker is Dr. Margot Hurlbert. She's a professor and a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy, and Sustainability Policy at the Johnson-Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Dr. Hurlbert researches climate change, water, energy, and agriculture with a specific focus on dry lands and vulnerable people. She is the coordinating lead author of the 2019 United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Land and Climate Report, and also an author of the same panel's 6th assessment report. Dr. Hurlbert is also a member of the Task Force on Transformations for Future Earth. Please welcome Dr. Margot Hurlbert as she delivers her presentation, Climate Change, Agriculture, Land, and Sustainable Development.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to speak about climate change and agriculture, land, and sustainable developments. Sustainable Development Goals 12 and 13. And I'm going to speak to it in the context of both the SDGs, 13, which is climate action, and 12, which is sustainable consumption, and my role in that regard, writing some of the land and climate, and then the 6th assessment report to the IPCC. So the Sustainable Development Goal 13 is has a purpose in it in education around climate change, and specifically in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So my screen isn't proceeding. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the UNFCCC and then follow it up with some of the Land and Climate Report and the AR6 materials. So the Land and Climate Report came out in 2019, and it was part of a 3 series of reports: the Cryosphere Report, the 1.5 Report, and the Land and Climate Report. Special reports of AR5, which are being followed up quickly by the 6th Assessment Report. And the 6th Assessment Report is slightly delayed due to COVID-19, and the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been delayed in Glasgow from last year and pushed forward into late 2021. So we're all crossing our fingers that that will be proceeding, as it has definitely delayed the business of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the purposes of the IPCC is to review the academic literature and provide guidance to the UNFCCC, the Conference of the Parties, when they're making decisions around policy and climate change. The Land and Food Report, the Land and Climate Report, dealt with the issues of food and water explicitly in relation to land and climate change and the very complex interconnections between. This is a figure from the Land and Climate Change, and what it shows is that the surface temperature over land is already increased to 1.9 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial temperature. So we've already exceeded, in that measure alone, exceeded the Paris Agreement commitments to try and maintain global warming around 1.5. This I know many of you have seen, but what it does show us is that the northern climates are actually some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and in Canada, that is very important to us for our north. So we're experiencing the impacts of climate change in Saskatchewan. And some of the most significant, I won't read off my statistics on this slide, some of the most significant of these, though, is the fact that our winters are less cold and that our growing season is actually much longer. We're also experiencing things like the advent of the West Nile virus, and of course, our pine beetle infestations have been worsened because of the changing climate. So there's many, many fronts which this is really impacting us now. We've made commitments in the past, and this is a really great figure coming out of the University of Ottawa that shows our commitments in the past and where we've gone on them. And we have failed miserably because we continue to increase in our greenhouse gas emissions. This is a compilation of statistics coming from the UNFCCC, and what it's showing us is that the aerosols, or the greenhouse gases, which are represented by the RCPs on the right, they're steadily increasing. This is back from 2014, and we actually need to make significant reductions in those greenhouse gases if we're going to achieve 1.5 degrees warming, which is represented by RCP 2.6 there at the bottom of the slide. So the significance and the amount of change that is needed is actually quite large. This is coming out of the 1.5 report, some information that the window of opportunity is still open, but it is closing very quickly. And many of the socioeconomic pathways that we're using in climate modeling is showing that the more we delay our actions, the more severe we're going to have to make reductions. And we're getting into the red of the diagram. We're actually going to have to use negative emission technologies. And what this means is we're actually not only going to have to stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere, we're going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the earth. So into the land, into the ocean, into places where it's been before. So sometimes people hear that and they think of the negative emission technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, and there are some pilots for this, but it's also our forests and our lands. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that after I talk about Saskatchewan's place in this. So we focus often on the low-hanging fruits, which are the coal, the power production sources, and driving our vehicles. And these are really, really important, and we can't lose focus. We need more wind, and we need more solar. But the share that land and agriculture contributes to our greenhouse gas emissions, although it's not as significant when you add together oil, gas, industry, and transportation by any means when you look at these pie charts, but agriculture and land is still something very significant and we should be focusing on it. So I worked on a paper coming out with Emin, a good friend of mine, and what we're talking about is agriculture is significant, and although we haven't seen the significant increases of global emissions from the slides I was showing you previously, we are seeing an increase in agriculture, and it does come from certain practices. We know from livestock, from soils, from the use of fossil fuels in the industry, and it comes from our sustainable use of our land. So this is a great figure that shows Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, not so bad, but how we use our land and how land plays into our GHGs is really important and something that we need to focus on. This is from the Land and Climate Report, and this is talking about just the land and greenhouse gas relationship. And it's not news. The top left-hand corner, when we're burning fossil fuels, we're releasing it. But in the bottom, I'm only going to speak very briefly on it, that direct air capture I mentioned, and bioenergy with CCS. So Saskatchewan came out with a carbon capture plant at Boundary Dam, which is the first of a kind. And that's the technology when we think of taking our wood products and actually burning them for energy and then putting them into the ground. That's a negative emission technology. But our forests and our soil practices and our agricultural practices are also really important when we think about this. So this figure comes from the Land and Climate Report, and what it's telling us is that there's certain things we do in agriculture that are really good for mitigation because they're storing more carbon in our land, they're keeping the water, the soil healthy, the carbon is going into our land with very deep-rooted perennial plants, and they're also good for adaptation, desertification, land degradation, food security. We have to keep in mind there's some trade-offs, and that is in relation to grasslands being reduced for cropland, which might have impacts on food security. So those are marked in red. But for the most part, good agriculture is good carbon accounting. This is just talking about how that was made up. So Sustainable Development Goal is about responsible production and consumption. So not only is the farming and the agricultural practices really important, but also the supply side practices in the entire food chain, and our consumption is really important. So balanced diets, eating less meat, and the amount of food waste that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions is about 22%. So we waste our food and that goes into excess emissions. Not only do we know practices really work, we also know, so my chapter was about policy and decision making, and we know there's an incredible complex area of interconnected policies and decision making that is actually addressing climate change that we really don't think about. So we focus a lot on carbon taxes, which are very, very important, but there's other really good best management practices for soils and water and agriculture that are really important components of this mix. So it's a suite of policy instruments required for reducing emissions reductions. There's just not one happy bullet that's going to work. And in agriculture, there has been a lot of discussion. There's some really neat policy that's being done in New Zealand and Ireland, talking about how to account not only for greenhouse gases, but for methanes and emissions, and how to incent agricultural production, whether it's at the farm gate or whether it's in the food supply. And this is a policy choice as well. There'll be carbon leakage. We need to think about border adjustments on the price of food and the virtual sale of food and where it's going. But there's excellent work that's happening in this policy realm. So we need to start thinking about it, talking about it, having our science inform the policy so that we have transparent monitoring, verification, and reporting. And that's something we've thought about a lot in industry and power production, but not so much in the agricultural sector in North America. And of course, there's local things that we can be doing as well. That the SDGs, just have to look them up, and some of them fell out of the IPCC report to eating less meat, eating more vegetarian, cutting our emissions. So thank you for that, and sorry for the technical difficulties at the forefront.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Appreciate your presentation. And remember, everybody will hold questions until the end of the 3 presentations. Our next presenter is Dr. Andrea Kraj. She's a professional engineer, an accomplished author and speaker, and an assistant professor here at the University of Saskatchewan in the School of Environment and Sustainability. She's at present in Manitoba, where she's currently dialing in from with her work on utility scale community-owned wind farm development, where she's helped rural farmer communities characterize their resources, establish community cooperative business models for the energy projects, and create feasible 150 to 300 megawatt wind energy projects. Her foundational work in energy policy for community power projects has enabled communities to retain ownership through project development and led others, including northern remote communities, to employ the community power model. Dr. Kraj advises on design, innovation, and business, and founded the company Core Renewable Energy, Inc. to empower community-oriented renewable energy projects worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to Dr. Andrea Kraj, who will speak on 3 C's: climate action through capacity building in community renewable energy.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the session to share your energy together today in this space. And as Dr. Liber has mentioned, today I'm going to speak on the climate action through capacity building in community energy, which is highly relevant to our global energy transition and reshaping our electricity sector. And this transition opens new opportunities to remote, rural, and Indigenous communities to meet their United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So remote, rural, and Indigenous communities and businesses are striving to negotiate their way into the electricity sector to enhance their own energy security, create new streams of wealth generation, and move forward in their ownership and prosperity. But yet there are still important challenges that they face to realizing the full economic and social benefits that renewable energy brings to small communities, especially capacity building for community energy planning. And I always like to remind myself, if it's in my own life or if it's in the work that I do, that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And it doesn't matter that we may not know where our path may lead us, but as long as we have an idea, that we begin to explore that path. So let's start with the first C, climate. Energy is everywhere, and the paradigms of our relationship to this energy are shifting. Pollution of our environment is no longer acceptable. Risking lives to have fuel transported through vulnerable communities is no longer acceptable. And monopolies, centralization of energy, these are becoming concepts of the past. They still work in some places, but they're not likely the key to unlocking our future energy potential, especially in remote northern communities. And just as I mentioned with my quote by Einstein, I also like to apply that in the same way, that the way we inhabit the cities of tomorrow, the communities of tomorrow, wherever we may be, cannot be created by the ways of today. We need to leapfrog, we need to think outside the box, and we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with this disruption. Our energy landscape is changing before our eyes. I'm sure you can see it everywhere around you. We are seeing a massive drop in the cost of renewable energy technology, particularly solar and wind, resulting in unprecedented adoption of renewables, while we're seeing an ever-increasing demand for energy. Yet a frustration exists in the mass consciousness due to the rising prices of energy, particularly electricity. And we're seeing the rise of the prosumer. This is a consumer who no longer consumes power only, but also sells power, produces power, sometimes for themselves, sometimes to sell back to the grid, or in a combination. So we need, and this is happening because progressive energy policies in some jurisdictions are enabling this to occur, as well as the rise of corporate PPAs, which are power purchase agreements. And we are encountering more frequent and devastating natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, typhoons all over the world. So the demand to rebuild in these regions is to leapfrog business as usual and solve this crisis with solutions that do not exist today. The status quo is no longer acceptable, and the people demand this. Islands, remote communities, wherever we may be, they will lead the way, because by their very nature, they are more susceptible to climate change with more dramatic responses. Remote communities, be it islands or geographically or electrically remote isolated regions, they represent just a microcosm of a greater reality that we will be facing, that we will face in our own communities. They will be the first to experience the devastating and catastrophic effects of climate change, and they will be the first in the transition to a new energy paradigm. Energy security is the biggest threat that faces humanity. It'll affect not only our livelihoods and quality of life, but right down to the basics of the water that we need to survive and the vital surgeries our hospitals need to provide, to the preservation of food for sustenance and medicine. Due to the high cost of electricity and unreliable systems, the threatened quality of life and the way that they've left populations vulnerable to the lack of healthcare and education and safety, we need to see changes happen. And what I've discovered in my own research is that in order to begin to solve the issues, we need to address energy sovereignty. Without the ability to produce our own energy in communities, these our own communities, other communities, we remain vulnerable to the control of foreign interests for our fuel supply. And this greatly jeopardizes the ability to control livelihoods and address energy crises when natural disasters strike. Energy sovereignty requires the use of indigenous natural resources that are local to the population. What I discovered was that we could not just solve this problem by relying on one type of resource alone, such as wind or solar in silos. That wasn't the solution. These resources are inherently variable in their nature, and yet they're complementary. And when we find the right recipe in putting them together and apply the right resources at the right location, with the right amount of storage, we can't forget storage, we can move any region to become more autonomous with renewable energy supply that is more reliable just due to the robust nature of having multiple resources for generating supply with storage. But what we must remember is that each location is as unique and individual as our own fingerprints. It'll have unique needs and resources available at that location, particularly space, available land, and the type of resource to that location. There'll be different priorities for supplying demand, such as critical infrastructure of hospitals, water, sewage treatment facilities, schools, transportation. And these priorities will change depending on the region and the jurisdiction, as well as every area will have a different policy and pricing structure. And so it's at this confrontational point that we find the catalyst to solving what we need to address for community energy development. It is the merging of technology, economics, and policy that go together. Because without the right policies in place, emerging technologies of community power projects just won't happen. And with the integration of healthy communities and appropriate economics in systems, projects are more likely to succeed. But we can't do it in silos. We need to come together in all these areas to really address these issues. And economics plays with the moving target, with the changing in the prices of the technology dropping, and human interaction and social behavior that create additional complexities. Policy is key to unlocking the development. Projects must be technology appropriate, and they must have the policies in place to enable them, especially if they're emergent. And so with this ever-changing dynamic, we're moving this industry is moving at a rapid pace forward. And so along the renewable energy spectrum, there are many options, but not all of them may be suitable. And as I mentioned before, it's often not just one alone, but it's in the harnessing of the complementary nature of the various generation resources and storage. And as you can see here from the spectrum, all of our energy comes from the sun. We begin there with solar energy, and this can be transferred by using conversion into photovoltaic energy, which produces electricity, thermal solar, which you can have heat from, or you can also use concentrated solar power. And there's methods to harness both heat and power, which we call combined heat and power. Wind happens just from the natural earth currents happening in our globe. And you can have onshore and offshore, and there's a wide spectrum of technology available, from as small as a 5 kilowatt wind turbine to the largest on the market right now as a single turbine of 12 megawatts. Bioenergy is a phenomenal resource that we could use, and it's also dispatchable. And there's many, many ways to convert bioenergy, from gasification, pyrolysis, anaerobic digestion, combustion, fermentation, and various biofuels. Water is also a very interesting area. Small hydro, run of the river, is considered sustainable, where we see now and we call large hydro not sustainable due to the impact that it has on the environment and the communities that surround it. Storage, there's a huge spectrum of storage technology available, and it all depends on how you want to dispatch and what you want to do with your storage. So you can work with various types of batteries, all the way to pumped hydro storage or compressed air energy storage and flywheels. But it all depends on getting the right combination at the right recipe and the right usage to really know how to succeed. And when we look at what's happening on the price spectrum, we see from the latest Lazard annual levelized cost of energy analysis report that the cost of renewable energy continues to decline. And certain technologies, which became cost competitive with conventional generation several years ago, are still competitive, and they maintain this competitiveness with the marginal costs of the selected existing conventional generation technologies. We can see here that solar thin film is the most affordable solar technology right now. Crystalline utility scales at $31, and we see the $29 of the solar thin film being the lower end, compared to wind at $26. And when we look at conventional gas combined, that's at $44 for unsubsidized pricing. And really the motivation behind all of this is local economic development. How can we help communities help themselves be sustainable? And with policy, there really is a need for engaging community-based projects to maximize local benefits. Yet there exists this competitive energy industry that values large power projects over community-based ones. So what we really need are clear, stable policies and legislation to provide opportunities for community groups to become engaged in renewable power projects. And since most countries have established conventional power, other forms like renewable energy are still considered new generation and in the need of defined support mechanisms. So we need policy to enable this. So let's look at the second C, community. Community power concerns itself with community ownership, community development, capacity building around energy generation and sustainability. There are 1.3 billion people on our planet that do not have access to electricity. That's 20% of our population. And when we look at remote communities, that number jumps to 90%. Like these children I worked with in Nicaragua who benefited from community-owned and operated solar installed on the rooftop of their school, many, many communities are like this around the world. They had this life-changing experience by these simple solar panels put on their rooftop in their school that enabled elders to learn in the evenings. It was absolutely life-changing. And we have similar problems in our own backyard in Saskatchewan, in our own remote communities in Kiniseo here with diesel still in their community. And our Arctic communities also face these extreme challenges, especially because their seasonal variations are that much more. So finding the right technology to fit in their communities, in their jurisdictions, with all of the aspects of their economics and the policy around that is a very complex challenge. And compared to urban baseline in terms of costs for diesel communities in our north, this is an example out of our Manitoba diesel communities where the urban baseline compared to our remote communities up north, the cost difference was 37 times more expensive. So it is substantially significant, and we don't often hear about just how expensive it is in our own backyard. So to give you a little context of what off-grid looks like, there are 280 off-grid diesel communities across Canada. 144 of these communities are Indigenous, and the Indigenous people represent 5% of the Canadian population, but they take on 50% of the diesel community aspect. And to compare a price to Saskatchewan, if you look, your baseline in Saskatchewan is 14.5 cents per kilowatt hour, and when you look up in Nunavut, the subsidized cost is double that at 28.4 cents per kilowatt hour. And when the power consumption moves past a certain rate class, say the 1,000 kilowatt hours per month class in winter and 700 in summer, the price jumps into the unsubsidized amount. And in Iqaluit, that's 56.7 cents. And in Kugaruruk, it's 112 cents per kilowatt hour. So we're seeing huge jumps. Yet energy transition is a federal government policy. Our government has said that they will ensure that the Indigenous communities that rely on diesel are powered by clean, reliable energy by 2030. Community power in Canada refers to the direct participation in ownership and of collective benefits from these renewable energy projects by and for the local community. Projects can be in part or full owned by cooperatives, Indigenous First Nations, Métis communities, charities, nonprofits, community groups, municipalities, schools, health centers, for example. And it is in its democratic ownership process where local groups are investing in their own communities. This is where we really see the benefits return back to those communities. And the research on it shows that it's quite significant, 3 to 4 times any non-community projects. So it's a triple win for community, individual investors, and the provinces. And we're seeing community scale Indigenous-driven projects happen. For example, here in this biomass plant that you can see. And the data and the research show that for every dollar paid to community-owned solar projects results in $2 of economic benefit to the provincial economy. And we know communities benefit from renewable energy generation by the very ownership that creates the long-term interest and local support. The local job creation stimulates the local economy, and the feelings of self-sufficiency and independence from foreign interests is significant to the well-being of the community, as well as the diverse energy generation by putting in different types of generation capabilities is what actually provides a more secure supply. And this is why this is an incredible opportunity for economic reconciliation. It's our time to address energy security. It's our time to solve global environmental crises together. And it's our time to build sustainable wealth in Indigenous communities. To give you a perspective of what is happening across Canada, this is a map of Indigenous community energy projects, just showcasing some of the work being done in terms of solar, hydro, wind, biomass, and some of the other aspects of projects just that fall under other, as well as transmission and energy efficiency. This looks like a lot, but there's still so much more potential to this. So let's talk about capacity, how we are making community energy a reality, particularly at the School of Environment and Sustainability through our Masters of Sustainability and Energy Security. The mission of our program is to empower a network of Northern Indigenous remote and career professionals through distance education and purpose-driven practical experience to lead sustainable community energy development. We are addressing the problems as per all these sustainable development goals that we're speaking about this conference in addressing climate change, in bringing energy security to our communities, coming at it with a sustainability approach, directly engaging with remote communities and focusing on economic development. And we are now having this opportunity to transcend disciplinary boundaries to manage complex problems and address sustainability challenges from the local to the global context. We are using knowledge transfer, local investment to build healthy communities. The program is a 2-year part-time delivery program designed to be taken while working or raising a family, and as well as done at remote distance. And it's really focused on Teams for Life, for making these life-lasting connections that you can rely on once you're out in the field, as well as during the program. And we're proud to say that we have 55% women and 54% Indigenous and Northern students this year. And when we look across some of our partners and what that looks like, like I mentioned, 54% Indigenous and Northern and 46% Southern rural. And some of our partners and First Nations on this slide. And I just want to speak to this amazing project that my colleague, Dr. Greg Peltzer, is leading called the CASIS Partnership. It's Community Appropriate Sustainable Energy Security. It involves 15 Northern and Indigenous communities. It has 17 public and private sector partners, 30 plus researchers across 4 countries. So in summary, as we address and strive to achieve our sustainable development goals, just as a caterpillar emerges from chrysalis as a butterfly, we need to change paradigms. We need to change the paradigms of what energy generation looks like and allow for distributed generation. We need to change policy to support the deployment of smart and clean technology and energy. And we need to change building and electrical codes to require construction practices for the integration of clean technology, as well as we need to change financial models to allow for mechanisms for us to create community appropriate renewable energy projects that reinvest in the people who they are meant to support. And we need to make energy planning and future energy planning the global standard using community energy planning best practices. After all, energy and power are long-term investments like our own homes and communities that we serve. And whenever the work becomes too heavy or challenging, I like to remind myself of the first law of thermodynamics, and that states that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed. And what that reminds me is that energy is all around us. It all has the potential to be turned into something else. And it means that wherever we look, there are opportunities. So I like to remind my students and my colleagues, I remind you to shine bright because you are brilliant and the earth is literally hiring us to solve these complex problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Wonderful presentation. Our third and final speaker today is Dr. Ajay Dalai. Dr. Dalai is a distinguished professor of chemical and biological engineering in the College of Engineering here at the University of Saskatchewan, where he also holds the title of Canada Research Chair in Bioenergy and Environmentally Friendly Chemical Processing. Dr. Dalai is a leading international expert in renewable energy, in green and catalytic reaction engineering, and in environmental pollution control. His innovative research has resulted in numerous patents for the processes and catalysts he's developed. He's authored over 550 research papers, an astonishing number if you ask me, and he's been awarded many international and national honors, such as the 2012 Fulbright Fellowship, the JSPS International Fellowship for Research in Japan, and the University of Saskatchewan J.W. Ivany, George Ivany Internationalization Award, among many others. His presentation is entitled Sustainable Clean Energy Production from Biomass.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizers at the University of Saskatchewan for inviting me to give this presentation. I'll be talking today on the clean, sustainable energy production from biomass. The outline of my presentation are as follows: introduce the topic to you, and then we'll discuss why biomass is a possible solution for the world's energy crisis. We'll talk about the biomass conversion technologies very briefly, give you some example on one of the technology that's called supercritical water gasification and hydrothermal liquefaction for the conversion of biomass. And then we'll talk about the our research on clean energy production from biomass, then summarize the discussion, and then followed by the acknowledgement. So if you look at the slide in the left, it gives the temperature anomaly over the planet, and the right side gives the CO2 concentration over the planet over last 100+ years. And we see that over last 50 years or so, there has been a drastic increase in the temperature and CO2 concentration over our planet. That is because of the population growth, as well as the more usage of the fossil fuel around the planet. And if you look at the graph in the left, you see there is a variation in temperature over every year. That's because in the summer months in the northern hemisphere, where we have a lot more forest, there is a lot more photosynthesis going on, which basically consumes the carbon dioxide with water vapor through photosynthesis to produce carbon in the plants, and then the CO2 concentration over the planet in the summer month, when we have summer month in the northern hemisphere, the CO2 concentration goes down, therefore the temperature is a bit lower. And when we have the winter in the northern hemisphere, there is less photosynthesis going on, therefore there is more CO2 over the planet, and there is a overall temperature rise. But nonetheless, over last 50 plus years, there has been increase in the CO2 concentration and temperature over our planet. And if you look at the global fossil fuel distribution or the consumption, they are quite non-homogeneous. And also the consumption per capita is much higher in some countries, 4 or 5 countries or so, compared to many other countries in this planet. If you look at the graph in the left, you see the consumption of petroleum, natural gas, and coal is gradually going up, and that what contributes to total energy that we need over the years, and that also contributes to global CO2 emission as well. And the graph in the right shows the global CO2 emission from few countries, which are a lot more than many other countries over the planet. So what are the issues? That is increased greenhouse gas emission, which leads to more temperature rise. And also of course there is a depletion of fossil fuel around the world as well. So the sustainable approach is to use the renewable resources and bio-based fuel, and of course can reduce the energy consumption as well. So again, the total and per capita CO2 emission, if you see in the graph in the left side, we have a few countries that produces a lot more CO2, and per capita we see that United States, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and few other countries, the per capita emission of CO2 is much higher as compared to many other countries in our planet. So when you use the fossil fuel for energy, we find that it's non-uniformly distributed over the planet and leads to higher emissions of sulfur, oxides of sulfur, nitrogen, and carbon, and it accelerates the global warming, and of course the sources are depleted. And if you see the graph in the middle, over about 20 years there has been an increase of about 1 degree C in the world average temperature, and a lot of this is coming from the usage of fossil fuel, which emits about 81% of carbon dioxide because of their use. And if let's look at the cartoon here, that we see that by usage of fossil fuel we have more global warming, more acid rain that leads to soil erosion, leads to deforestation, poor air quality, and also leads to the hazardous to biological systems. So now let me bring your attention to the greenhouse gas emission in Canada. So we have this oil and gas sector, the electricity generation sector, the transportation sector, and heavy industry sector. They contribute a lot for the overall greenhouse gas emissions. Again, about 80% of the emission is because of carbon dioxide. And I'm very happy to report that Canada bought into the Kyoto and Paris Accord, and according to Kyoto Protocol, we have to reduce 6% of the total reduction in greenhouse gas emission by 2012 compared to 99 level of 481 megatons. And no countries in the planet was able to meet the Kyoto Protocol, and we had a Paris Accord in 2015, and under this agreement Canada has pledged to reduce its greenhouse gas emission by 30% below 2005 level by 2030, and developed countries including Canada are committed to spending at least 100 billion a year between 2000 and 2025 to help emerging economies deal with the effects of climate change. And how do we tackle the climate change? We have to reduce the greenhouse gas emission by using the renewable energy resources, and biomass can be produced within a relatively short cycle, and its utilization maintains a closed carbon cycle. And also the plant biomass emits very little sulfur and nitrogen when it's used as a fuel source, and also the bio-derived fuel, liquid can be a promising substitute for the conventional fossil-based fuel. If you look at this particular slide, you find that carbon dioxide that is produced from the human activities can also be taken up by the plant for its growth, and then which can be again used to produce biofuel for human for our usage, and therefore it's a more or less carbon dioxide neutral process. Now let me discuss about the possible solution for world energy crisis. So when you compare the first generation fuel and second generation fuel from biomass with the petroleum refinery materials, for the first generation fuel, we find there is a food versus fuel issue, and that's why the second generation fuel became more popular, where the bio oil and the waste vegetable oil, etc., are used to produce the fuel that we can use. And when the target is to use the biomass that are basically not competing for fuel for food. For example, we can use the sewage biomass, municipal solid waste, animal residue, industrial residue, forest crop and residue, and agricultural crop and residue, which are again renewable. They produce less sulfur and nitrogen, and they have a low emission, they're carbon neutral, and they're more or less uniformly distributed throughout the planet. And this particular slide shows how the renewable energy, which is consists of hydropower, wind, solar, and biomass, the trend is increasing over the years. And the one in the right shows that the biofuel production in North America and South and Central America and Europe are a bit much has higher growth rate as compared to other countries in the planet. And why? Because they have there is upsurge in the investment, they have great potential, and they're of course abundantly available. So the current trend in the growth of biofuel is from the gaseous fuel to liquid fuel, because the liquid fuel, the energy density is much higher, and we are looking at producing the liquid fuel from the lignocellulosic biomass. And let me again bring your attention to the renewable fuel standard and low carbon fuel standard in Canada. So the federal government has mandated 5% ethanol, 2% biodiesel in the diesel fuel, and many different provinces have similar or better mandate, so that so as to increase the renewable fuel content in our fuel. And in Canada also, we find that with 0.5% of world population, we have about 10% of 10% of world forests. And what that tells us is that there are more than 143 million tons of carbon per year is available for biofuel production. And if you look at the biofuel energy production, that over last 15 years or so, we have gone from say from 2 terawatt hour to 16 terawatt hour. So there is a increase of 8-fold of energy production from biofuel over last 15 years in Canada. So when you're looking at the usage of lignocellulosic biomass for energy production, we are looking at this basically a biomass that contains about 35 to 50% cellulose, 20 to 40% hemicellulose, and 10 to 25% of lignin. And again, they are economical, no net CO2 increase on combustion, and they're abundantly available. And of course, there are drawbacks, such as they are seasonally available, and they of course need some pre-treatment for conversion. And the examples are the energy crops and woody biomass and agro residue. So what are the energy crops? This is basically a plant grown at a low cost and low maintenance harvest, used for making biofuel or combusted for its energy content to generate heat or electricity. So the ideal sources of energy crop are that they are fast growing, short rotation, and high yield. They should be able to grow in marginal or degraded land, and there is a low requirement of energy intensive agricultural practice, and no competition with food crops for nutrients or sunlight. So the examples are willows and poplar, and elephant grass and timothy grass. So now let me talk a little bit about the biomass conversion technology for clean, sustainable energy production. So there are three different pathways: the chemical conversion, biochemical conversion, and thermochemical conversion pathways available for the conversion of biomass to different products. Of course, there are certain drawbacks of biomass for energy production. They have low energy density. They are a bulky solid, so it's uneconomical for transportation. They have varying composition. They have different physical and chemical properties. And of course, there are a lack of robust technology in some cases. So like any other industry, biofuel industry also for its success requires proper management of feedstock and also processing and many other factors. Now let me talk a little bit about the supercritical water gasification and hydrothermal liquefaction technology. So we are all familiar with water, and when we increase the temperature of water to more than 374 degrees C and 22.1 megapascal or more than 200 atmosphere, we find that it has a very different properties, and it's very good for conversion of biomass to different products. And in this graph, you see that we have the treatment temperature versus treatment time for hydrothermal gasification, liquefaction, carbonization, and pretreatment technologies. And in the right, we see that pressure versus temperature for water to produce hydrogen-rich gas or methane-rich gas from biomass, and also you can produce various liquids, and also you can produce different chemicals through the treatment at different temperature and pressures with biomass. And if you can see that the properties of water on different conditions, such as the density, viscosity, dielectric constant, ionic properties, heat conductivity, and heat capacity are very, very different. And there are different chemical reactors also used for different hydrothermal gasification processes. And let me talk a little bit about our own research on clean energy production from biomass. So we have been working on different processes for last 20 plus years. So we have been producing bio-oil through hydrothermal liquefaction process from agricultural biomass, and it's upgrading to transportation fuel. We have been working on the production of hydrogen and syngas, which is a mixture of hydrogen and CO, through supercritical water gasification of biomass. We have been working on the activated carbon production and biopellet production, biodiesel production, glycerol conversion, and also production of green diesel from synthesis gas, and production of ethanol and higher alcohol from synthesis gas, and also the utilization of methane and carbon monoxide, which are both basically greenhouse gases for syngas production. And also we've been working on getting cleaner fuel from the petroleum feedstock, and also the synthesis and industrial application of carbon nanotubes for various processes. So just want to introduce one technology, which is the hydrothermal liquefaction technology, where we take different form of biomass and we have water, and when we use increase the temperature to 330 to 700 degrees C and the pressure is 190 to 220 atmosphere, we can convert this biomass to different chemicals and biooil and also solid residue and also gas. For example, if you take 3.75% of canola meal and 11.25% wheat flour and add 85% of water, we can produce 85% of aqueous phase and 5% of oil, 8% of solid, and 2% of gas. And what we do with this biofuel that we produce, we basically look at the boiling point distribution of the biofuel that is extracted with a solvent called ethyl acetate, and we find that about 62% of this fraction is in heavy gas oil range, and about 18% is the light vacuum gas oil range as we compare them with the petroleum products. But there are also challenges of using the bio-crude as a fuel, as you see in this particular slide. And also we want to blend this with petroleum feedstock so that it can be fed to the refinery for further processing. And what we did is we look at the boiling point distribution of the biofuel and compare that with some of the petroleum fractions, so they really match very well. And we also wanted to blend the biofuel with the heavy gas oil, and we find that if you take 10% of the biofuel and take 90% of a petroleum fraction such as heavy gas oil and blend it at 120 degrees C for 5.5 hours, we can produce a homogeneous mixture. And take that homogeneous mixture and put in a refinery, and we are able to remove about 23% oxygen with a particular material, particular catalyst, and a 28% of oxygen with another catalyst that we produce in the laboratory. And the biochar that we get from this process, about 8 to 10%, they have basically many different applications. And this biochar is coming from the biomass. It has a fuel application, it has soil application, it also can be applied for carbon credit, and you can make specialty materials and also pharmaceutical materials, and also make different chemicals from this as well. So the way it is done is biomass is converted to a biochar, and that biochar is converted to activated carbon. And when you look at the biomass, it has maybe very little value, but the activated carbon you can sell for $2 a pound, for example. And we have worked with the SaskPower in Saskatchewan for over 10 years and created a very select or specific material, microporous material from this biochar. So what we found is that we can inject about 1 pound of the functionalized biochar or the activated carbon for a million cubic feet of the flue gas, and we can take out about 90% of the mercury that this flue gas contains. And Canada emits roughly 2,500 kilograms of mercury that fall into the water and soil bodies and come back to the human being in the food chain. And the idea is to remove this mercury at the source so that this can not harm the biological, the animal and human beings. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea what we are up to. Just to summarize this talk, though 220 billion metric tons of biomass is available worldwide every year, the development and utilization of biomass conversion technology for clean energy production has not yet been sustainable to meet Paris Accord. And biofuel that we produce can lead to biodiesel production, and we are able to produce a high quality transportation fuel from this. And also, as I mentioned, we have developed a technology to remove the elemental mercury from the flue gas stream, and this technology has been implemented by SaskPower to remove the mercury from the flue gas. So what is the take-home message? That biomass is a resource pool for sustainable clean energy and biocarbon production for economic and environmental benefits. The investment of bioenergy production is increasing day by day. Appropriate processing technology should be applied for clean, sustainable energy production, depending on the availability and nature of biomass and product demand. So these are some of the references used in this presentation, and this slide shows that we have more than 20 or 25 companies have worked with us over years, and this slide shows my master's, PhD, and postdoctoral fellow supervisors that I would like to acknowledge, and these are my collaborators from the university over the years, and these people are my international collaborators for research. So it's about more than 30 people that have been collaborating from international, from the communities outside this campus. And this is my research team at the University of Saskatchewan. So we have over 30 people per year working on different projects to create technology for the society, and also create new knowledge for people to benefit from. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for your attention, and I hope it was useful to you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Ajay. So with that, we're done with the three presentations, and we will start the question and answer session. And I am told that all three presenters are here live to answer questions. So the chat function is now open, and I encourage everyone to please use the chat function to send us your questions, and I will read them off. And make sure you send them to everyone so people can see what your questions are. And I see that we already have one that's come in here. So a quick question. First of all here, thank you all for such insightful presentations. Zachary has a question for Andrea Kraj. Aside from the potentially costly option of trial and error, how do you imagine the recipe of renewable energies will be determined for the different communities?
Excellent question. I love it because we know we don't need to imagine it anymore because the science is there. What we do is we do simulation and modeling. And part of my research is exactly that, is in the simulation and modeling of microgrid systems for remote applications. And my research involves the simulation of putting these different generations and storage together and modeling these systems so that we know, also with the cost models, what is the best recipe given the resources at a particular location. So for example, I can just give you one that's quite popular that I like to speak about, is an island that I did research on in the middle of Brazil, where we had 3 diesel gensets. And by using the modeling and applying the science and to this, we were able to see how the island could move from being pretty much 90% on a diesel power. It went from 90 to 100% when it lost its wind turbine on diesel, and transitioning them with an energy plan, which is why we talk about community energy planning our energy futures, moving them to have a mix of solar power, wind power, biomass, and storage in the form of battery, and then still utilizing a diesel backup generator that was there if need be. And that was able to reduce the price of their electricity by, depending on the time of day, because it does fluctuate on usage and availability and things like this, but really substantially, I would say between 50 to 90%, depending on the time of day. So modeling's there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. There's a question here for, let's see, it's coming in so fast they're disappearing off my screen here. A question for Margot. What are some of the collective steps we can take to combat sort of climate change besides eating less meat?
Yeah, so I had some of those at the end of my presentation, and I didn't read out every individual one, of course. So COVID is really interesting in the context of how it relates to climate change and risk perceptions, because it really has changed how we work and how we live. And we are reducing emissions because we're not traveling as much and we're not driving to work. So we're seeing benefits there. But the reality is we're actually not seeing enough of a change that we're going to be able to address climate change. So what it tells us is it's not just our consumptive lifestyle in relation to our fossil fuel transportation that's going to have to change, but it's going to have to change on a number of sectors and in a number of areas. And that's kind of why I was getting at power production is great and we cannot lose focus. So let's not take the focus away, but let's understand that it's a complex, cascading, interconnecting, wicked problem. And COVID is teaching us certain things about our lifestyles, but it's also pointing out the degree of change that we're going to need to have to make in order to address the situation and achieve a net zero emissions by 2050 is what everybody's talking about in order to really get behind this. So the model's actually showing we're going to overshoot. And we're going to have to use those negative emission technologies, of which biochar is actually, if it's used in the context of fertilizer, is one of those negative emission technologies. So how do we reduce emissions in agriculture, and how do we increase the amount of carbon that land is using so carbon sinks? And some of this is our no-till practices. So the farmers in the prairies here in Canada and the United States, we actually do a great job of keeping water in the soil and not drying it out, which is forming a carbon sink. So we need to be able to sustain those types of practices and produce the food that we need, but do it when we're striving towards net zero. So part of it's the science, part of it is our entire lifestyle, and part of it is imagining that net zero at 2050. So that's really, and I don't want to keep going because others need to ask questions, but that's really the exciting part of where I like to see the research and thinking about that imaginary of net zero carbons in 2050. So thanks for the question.
And thank you for the answer. There's a question here that could be for either Andrea or Ajay, so we will see who jumps to the microphone first. The question here is, there has not been much mentioning of geothermal energy. What is the state of geothermal energy production in Western Canada? And maybe why haven't we heard too much about it yet?
Well, this is not part of my expertise, but what I know is geothermal energy has a very high potential when you are recovering energy from the Earth's surface by injecting cold water into the formation and then generating hot water for usage. I think it has a lot of potential, but because of our low cost natural gas investment in Canada, this technology has not been very popular. But I see that in the countries where there's not a lot of natural gas available for heating water, for example, this technology would have a lot of benefit. I see there's a lot of tremendous potential of this technology.
Yeah, and I can add to that geothermal is specific to what is available at that site. There's different types of geothermal ways to do your loops. You could do surface loops, you could do deep wells. And actually in Saskatchewan, there was a recent announcement of, I believe, I can't remember exactly where, it's in southern Saskatchewan, but there's one of the largest geothermal projects that will be happening in Canada. It's already underway. So it's definitely developing. The technologies there. There's some new innovative changes happening to doing deep extraction. But as to Dr. Ajay's point, is that when you compare it to what is available and the cost price, what is the incentive for somebody to do it? So we have to look to the behavior and the incentives, the social understanding of the technology and the implementation of it. I do know that in a housing development here in Manitoba, because I'm still here in Manitoba, that a few, maybe 10 years ago, there was a new development with geothermal put in, and those homes were not popular because they were they paid a higher premium, and people didn't want to pay an extra $30,000 or $40,000 for their home just to have geothermal, because the mindset wasn't there yet, and the timing was not right. But it doesn't mean that it's a bad thing moving forward. It depends how, again, you put your energy plan in place, and if you are building new, to consider what those options are depending on where you're located, on what piece of land, and what are the thermal properties of the land that you're located on, to harness the most efficient use of that technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So another question here for Professor Dalai. In general terms, between biomass gasification and hydrothermal treatments, which one has proven better results for the use of biomass as a source of renewable energy?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that excellent question. I think I just wanted to before I answer that question, I just wanted to thank Roxanne, Megan, and the entire team at the International Office for doing an excellent job in putting this PAW 21 conference. So regarding this particular question, just wanted to mention that when you look at the biomass conversion, there are typically three technology that people like to use. One is pyrolysis, the other one is gasification, the third one is combustion. In the third world countries, when they require a lot of energy, they basically use combustion technology to produce energy for cooking, for example, or protecting themselves from the cold winter spills. And how that happens is just by supplying excess of air or excess of oxygen. So you combust the entire biomass, it produces a lot of energy. But in case of pyrolysis, it's a technology that requires no oxygen. So just heat it in absence of oxygen. And the main product is basically liquid and biochar. And in case of gasification, there is a supply of oxygen in a controlled amount, and that gives more hydrogen and carbon monoxide and less carbon dioxide, unlike the combustion process. And the hydrogen and carbon monoxide, as I pointed out in my talk, is basically a building block to get transportation fuel and also get additional hydrogen, which is a clean fuel. And also hydrogen and carbon monoxide is a building block for many chemicals. So that's why the gasification technology is very, very useful. But when you look at the hydrothermal technology, we are looking at using the water that is inherent in the biomass so that you don't really dry it, unlike in pyrolysis and combustion process. And in that case, our target is to produce more liquid, and which is more for transportation sector. And we produce very little gas, 1 to 2% gas, unlike gasification process where the gas would be more like 90 to 95%. And here we also produce biochar as well, which is has a lot of uses. So to summarize my response, depending on what the end goal is to produce hydrogen and CO or transportation fuel, so accordingly, one has to choose gasification or hydrothermal technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. I've got another question for Andrea that I'm going to simplify and paraphrase a little bit. Why in the world is energy so much more expensive when you go up north than it is down south?
Well, I see this question is in reference to Saskatchewan. So I could say it depends on the jurisdiction, first of all. And in comparing Saskatchewan just even to Manitoba, there's different rate classes in Manitoba, depending on where you are and what type of a user, what kind of class you are. So we have sort of an urban baseline. And then when we go up north for diesel, first of all, there are diesel communities that are not connected to the grid. So there's a cost to importing that fuel into those communities. And those are the ones that are not grid connected that often have a different price points. So when you get your usage beyond a certain threshold, you jump into a next sort of a usage class, and there's a different cost to it. So a lot of the lower priced ones are subsidized rates, and then we get into the unsubsidized rates. And so when you start layering that, and particularly in Manitoba, we have like different, if you're in an education facility, if you're a First Nation, if you are a government office, you get sort of a different surcharge on that. So when I was explaining in my presentation that 37 times more expensive amount, it factors in those. So that it was around, like, I think it's still now around $2.90. Don't quote me on that because I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but we're looking like substantially more. When we look at Saskatchewan, the difference here is that what we must consider, we're in a sort of a different a price situation, but we're still seeing more expensive prices for energy, for electricity, for fuel up where we are in the north compared to the south. And the reason here is that there's a different usage case. You have to look at the socio-economic behavior here of the communities. And what I'm interested in, this is part of our research in our research team at SENS, but what I'm starting to suspect is how many users there are per meter. Do we know how many people are in a certain building or a certain home and how much energy is being used for that location? So relatively speaking, is that location expending more energy because there's more usage there and of course it's winter, so then we have insulation issues and beyond the factor of weather changes and so on and so forth, or summer with air conditioning, if that. What is the usage case and what is actually happening in those situations? And that's part of our research. We're looking into that to discover why is that actually happening beyond what we suspect. So it's a complex problem we're working on.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And maybe I'll take a moderator's prerogative and ask a question for Margaret. Obviously, in your presentation, you explained that agriculture and plant growth in general is a good way of carbon capture. But all of the data still suggests that the atmosphere is warming faster than we want it to, and we're still going in the wrong direction. If that keeps being the case, what's the greatest threat to the agricultural industry in Saskatchewan? Because there's two sides. We can lose part of the industry, but then we're also losing the carbon capture. So what's the biggest risks as a province?
Yeah, thanks for that excellent question as a moderator's prerogative. In Saskatchewan, we are blessed in that we have, my first slide around climate change shows a bit of the opportunity. We have this extended growing season, and the fact is our warming means that our agricultural land is actually moving northwards. But what we're seeing is the southwest part of the province is drying and suffering increasing aridity. In fact, the soil of Saskatchewan over the past 100 years has been getting drier. So we know that we're getting drier, but we're also, because of our landscape between Alberta and Manitoba, we're suffering from situational or locational flooding in an increasing amount. So we're actually getting hit from both directions. We're getting increasing aridity and drought, and we're also getting these flooding events in the spring or with excessive rainfall events. So the threat is actually happening in the context of climate change, but we also have opportunities. So for agricultural production, it's becoming more vulnerable in the sense to both drought and flood, and also having more opportunity in relation to better technologies, expanded growing seasons, but also for the opportunities around better plant varieties that are also reducing the emissions of agriculture into the atmosphere. So there's really a lot going on in the agricultural space around threats and opportunities. And what we found in our research about vulnerability and adaptation in the prairies over the last 2 decades is it's very localized, and generally extreme events of droughts that happen for 2 to 3 to 5 years are very regional. And we haven't seen anything like the 1930s for quite some time, but into the future, we're going to see these extreme droughts coming up. So can we adapt our agricultural system to having more rain in the winter and not having the ice pack, which impacts the soil and its dryness. And it also impacts how much carbon it's storing. So we really need to get our head around not just the adaptations and vulnerabilities, but link it towards the carbon and the impacts on carbon emissions that our soil practices are having. So I didn't really come off one way or the other, but I guess I can tell a short story. I was talking to one of the river basins in Alberta yesterday, one of the watershed groups, and they were almost decimated last spring because of a drought that was coming, and they only had one rainfall that saved them. So they're very, very much worried about the issue of drought going into the future. And that's not something that we who are living in the cities or the academic institutions think about all the time. So drought is a significant issue for the prairies going into the future.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And due to time, we're going to have to end the session here. So I want to thank all of our three speakers for their presentations and for answering all of the questions from the audience. And of course, thank the audience for answering a bunch of brilliant questions. So thank you all, and thank you for a great session. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jay.
Thanks, Karsten, and thanks to the session presenters. That was a really interesting session.